Though the series has always flirted with scares, it's debatable whether or not Core's original Tomb Raider games classify as horror in the 32-bit survival sense. In the TRLE universe, the fan base has embraced the engine's innate horror capabilities with open arms, crafting some eerie and downright terrifying scenarios. Tomb Cool's Purgatory 2 is a dark, edgy mini-horror game that mostly succeeds in being both frightening and a decent Tomb Raid. Purgatory 2 begins at Laura's high school graduation party. Hosted at the Croft Manor, things are, or at least are alluded to, be going just fine before a supernatural threat breaks loose, tearing Laura's classmates limb from limb. After escaping the manor, Laura heads to her school. The evil has taken hold here too, though things are much worse, with the infrastructure being consumed by a horrific flesh-like creep. Continuing into the basement and eventually off to a neighboring apartment complex, Laura dispatches the Hellspawn with her steadily growing arsenal, attempting to find the evil's source. In the apartment complex, the story begins to come together with a few strewn notes, hinting at a horrific crime involving a child. I won't give it away, but suffice to say the whole thing is icky. It's the type of over-the-top horror you'd read in a goth kid's high school notebook. Tomb Cool has done a good job with the environmental design and progression, and I love the brooding atmosphere hanging over most of the game. However, the grotesqueness of it all did begin to irritate me by the end of the last level. If you're squeamish, Purgatory 2 may not be for you. In spite of both the horror and teenage Laura aesthetic, Purgatory 2 is still very much combat-oriented. You begin with your pistols and quickly amass a small arsenal. The enemy variety is good, with a mix of both original monsters and some familiar faces, like the poison-spewing mutants from the RX Tech Mine. Balancing combat is hard to do in Tomb Raider, but Tomb Cool has nailed a healthy medium of action and survival. The opening level in the Croft Manor is a great start and is the best level in the game in spite of its familiarity. Tomb Cool has put in a few reworks, but any longtime fan will be able to find their way around the manor with relative ease. With the power cut, the manor is aptly dark, and several of these darkened corners hide surprise monster reveals. I honestly jumped a few times in the manor thanks to Tomb Cool's excellent use of darkness, camera switches, and sound effects. Trudging through the Croft Manor, witnessing the aftermath of the outbreak felt akin to classic PlayStation or Saturn survival horror, and I absolutely loved it. That said, the manor isn't the open playground from the mainline games, with dead ends funneling players down a preset route. However, the forces of evil are on Laura's turf, and veteran players will get a kick of working the floor plan to their advantage. The next level, Laura's high school, is still aptly creepy, though focused more on navigation and puzzle solving than outright scares. Purgatory 2's recurring key obstacle is introduced here, the aforementioned fleshy carpet crawling over the floors and walls. Step in it, and Laura ignites. Some sections, like the library, are fun as Laura literally has to avoid the hot lava ground as she climbs over the bookshelves. Other parts seem to bend the rules a bit, allowing Laura to step in the creep without consequence, though these safe zones are more or less telegraphed by platforming cues. The basement looks right out of Nightmare on Elm Street, and traversing its moody hallways and crypts can be a lot of fun. There's a cool puzzle involving raised platforms and torches from the get-go, though other puzzles prove more frustrating, namely one involving diving to retrieve an artifact. Diving into the pool by accident, I noted an item below the surface by fluke as Laura gasped for breath prior to the game over screen. There is a small tell with lighting and camera adjustment, but it still felt a bit unfair, and I passed this section by fluke. The final act, the murder scene, is the weakest of the chapters. In traveling back and forth between a dilapidated house and an apartment complex, Laura uncovers the root of evil, and things get considerably grosser. From swimming a sewer chute to the constant wailing of a baby in the background, Purgatory 2's final act becomes downright annoying and uncomfortable, laying the horror on a bit too thick. Some of the puzzles, too, are downright sadistic, like one where Laura must jump between spaces on a board of flame pits while being struck by lightning. The triggers here don't always work, and I had to redo the segment about 10 times before I finally passed. The first boss is a sight to behold, and a nice uptick in pace and mood after the final level. After you defeat her, Laura is transported to a new area for the epilogue boss fight, which, despite being on a time limit, is considerably less exciting as the boss has a nasty habit of getting stuck on the architecture. Purgatory 2 incorporates a slew of textures, assets, music, and sound effects not only from Tomb Raider, but other games. The borrowed assets all fit the game perfectly, making for environments that are still readable as a TRLE, but feel like something genuinely new. Figuring out what I could and couldn't interact with didn't take long, and I soon found a normal Tomb Raider groove. The music arrangements are great, and fans of Turn of the Millennium action and shooter games will note a few tracks ring familiar. The sound effects too are used to great effect, with victims pleading for their lives, horrific roars, and parsed, ghostly breaths. As mentioned, the baby crying sound clip from the final act gets irritating, but other than that, Purgatory 2's sound direction is quite good and shows just how scary the Tomb Raider engine can be. Purgatory 2 is an ambitious set of levels horror fans will likely enjoy. The opening section in the Croft Manor is the highlight, so if you lose interest after that, don't feel as though you're missing out on too much. Having said that, there are some late game surprises worth seeing for those willing to endure the horror. Not all of its parts work as they should, but overall, Purgatory 2 is a highly playable and unique horror experience.